And there we go. Okay. Good evening, folks, and welcome to the 25-26 Institute for Northern Studies Public Seminar Series. My name's Dr. Andrew Lind, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing these sessions. Now, for those of you joining us who've been at one of our seminar sessions in the past, you'll know all of my spiel, so please distract yourself for the next 30 seconds as I go through some important housekeeping. But you'll have noticed that on your screen tonight, your camera and your microphone are currently disabled. And that's just to make sure that the quality of the recording is as good as possible, because tonight's session is being recorded and will be made available on the Institute for Northern Studies YouTube channel, so you can relive all the fun of tonight and you can send it all to your friends and family, which would be great, because it'd be great to get as many people as possible looking at that resource. But fear not, when we get to the question and answer session tonight, I will be enabling, your camera and your microphone, so you can put your questions directly to our speaker. Now, you may have noticed that there were some Explorathon stickers on some of the slides that were on before we started this evening, and that's because the INS Seminar Series is a proud partner of the Explorathon initiative, which aims to publicise research at Scottish universities while making it more accessible and strengthening connections with our communities. Now, tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ian MacLellan. Ian completed his PhD at the University of Strathclyde last year after successfully defending his thesis on the hunting and preservation of game on the Breadalbane estates between the 16th and 18th centuries. His research interests centre around Scottish social and environmental history, particularly the management and exploitation of wild or natural resources such as game, a topic which he's published work on within the Scottish Historical Review and Ruralia. Alongside his academic work, Ian is also the co-founder of Ichnos Heritage, a heritage consultancy based in Glasgow and in Athens. And tonight, Ian will be sharing some of his ongoing research with us in his paper titled Early Modern Hunting in a Highland Context, Conclusions from a Study of the Breadalbane Estates. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the man himself. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. Can I just check that you can see my slides that are on the screen? Yep, excellent. Okay, so as Andrew said, I'm going to be walking you through some of my findings from research into hunting and game control in the Breadalbane estates from the 16th to the 18th century. But before we do that, I wanted to tell you a little story. So I'm not sure where everyone is joining us from, but I suspect that some of you may be familiar with Rannochmoor. So what you can see on your screen just now is a picture of a series of mountains known collectively as the Blackmount Massif now. In the early modern period, these mountains formed part of a large deer forest called Coiricaba. And it was there in 1621 that the Earl of Mar was hunting with Duncan Campbell of Glenorchy. As they were hunting, the Earl noticed a white hind, a white female deer, and got quite excited about this and decided to write to King James VI and First and tell him what he had seen. James was a very keen hunter, was quite enthused by this sighting and decided over the winter of 1621-1622 that he wanted to capture this white deer. So he appointed a man called John Scandiver and two assistants who were foresters in his English forest of Windsor to travel to the Highlands and to capture this deer. So John Scandiver and his two aides duly departed from the south of England and via Edinburgh arrived at Balloch, which is now called Taymouth, near Kenmore on the River Tay, in mid-February. Duncan Campbell of Glenorchy reluctantly entertained them. I imagine there was quite a lot of rolling of eyes, and decided that he was too old and infirm himself to join them on this quest for the white deer. But he sent his son Robert with the foresters to the Glenorchy hunting tower at Achalader. When they arrived in Achalader, which is on the eastern side of Rannoch Moor, bear in mind this is February, and if anybody's been across Rannoch Moor in February, it's not a very hospitable place. The local people and Robert Campbell of Glenorchy told Scandiver that it wasn't possible to ride a horse across Rannoch Moor at this time of year to get to Corrichabah. They would have to walk. In a piece of correspondence about the incident, the weather was reported to be vehement. Make of that as you will. So the party duly departed Achalader and started to cross Rannoch Moor. Bear in mind, this is February in Scotland. Partway across Rannoch Moor, they came into view of Corrichabah, and the particular corrie within the deer forest where the deer had been sighted was called Corriessen. It's to the left of this photograph. So this photograph shows the corrie of Corrichabah itself. And just, if you imagine, just over the ridge to the left is Corriessen, quite a steep-sided corrie. Scandiver, seeing the terrain in front of him, the weather, and the general conditions, decided that he couldn't go on any further. But his assistants and Robert Campbell carried on, and they managed to get up into the corrie where they saw a large herd of deer, including the famed white hind. Made no attempt to capture it, but they could report that they had seen it and it did exist. They then escorted Scandiver back to Achalader, and from Achalader back eventually to Westminster via Glenartney, where he stopped to try and capture some deer to take back to the king. So having returned to King James with his tail between his legs, no white hind in evidence, James actually looked quite kindly on the whole incident and decided that because the white hind may have been in calf, it was probably best that she be left to her own devices, at least until she could foal. So that is the story of the White Hind of Corrichabah. And the reason I opened with that was just that I think it outlines some of the key issues when we think about hunting in the late medieval and the early modern period. It's hard to overstate how important hunting was to aristocratic and royal culture, and how obsessive some aristocrats and some kings became about hunting. James was pretty obsessive about hunting. And it also outlines probably some important differences between the way hunting was managed in England and the way it was managed in the Highlands of Scotland. So in England, most deer were kept in parks or in small forests where they could be easily managed. In Scotland, not only in the Highlands, also in the borders, the favoured method for managing deer in reserves was forests, and we're going to talk more about that later. But this little incident is a nice opener into what we're going to be looking at tonight. So, what are we going to be looking at? I'll be telling you a little bit about how people hunted and fished in the 16th and 17th centuries. We'll be looking a little bit at tenant poaching, so what commoners were doing to access game. And then we'll look a little at deer forests in the Breadalbane area, who the keepers of the forests were, who were raiding those forests, and what kind of disputes emerged around those forests. But before we do any of that, I need to introduce the Campbells of Glenorchy. So the Campbells of Glenorchy may be familiar to some of you. They're a sept of Clan Campbell who expanded their territory from northern Argyll into Breadalbane in the later 15th and the 16th centuries. The 6th Lord Glenorchy Celyn or Grey Colin, and the 7th Lord Glenorchy Donkey Dhu, or Black Duncan, were particularly instrumental in establishing a strong and consolidated lordship in the area. The person on your screens at the moment is Donkey Dhu, Black Duncan, who was Lord Glenorchy from 1573 to 1631, so quite a long lordship. And Colin and Duncan were expert proponents of what David Stevenson calls aggressive feudalism. So they utilised a range of tactics to obtain territory and build a network of control and influence in Breadalbane. They were so successful that in 1681, their descendant became an earl, the first Earl of Breadalbane, and the family remained highly influential in British politics in the later 17th and 18th centuries. So that's who the Campbells of Glenorchy are. And where we're talking about is broadly a band across the middle of this map. So Glenorchy itself is, let me show you, Glenorchy itself is around here. The Glen runs up to Bridge of Orchy. The Campbells of Glenorchy had land holdings in many places, but the key core territory they controlled ran from Lismore across Lorne through Glenorchy itself, down Glendochart and along to Loch Tay and stretched up into the Rannoch area. So a kind of band from Aberfeldy to Lismore really is the territory we're talking about. And one of the reasons that it's so good to study the Campbells of Glenorchy is that there is a vast archive in the National Records of Scotland that was bequeathed to the General Registry in 1926 and is publicly available. Within that record, there are Baillie Court books that cover, with breaks, the period 1573 to 1748. What we're going to look at tonight is a more detailed analysis of the Baillie Court books that cover 1573 to 1657. Sorry about the specificity of that. Within the archive, there are also various commissions, tax and contracts, estate correspondence, estate management documents, including instructions to foresters, and a massive sub-archive, if you like, of papers relating to a dispute over MacLellan forest that ran from about 1730 to 1744. So that's the kind of archival material that's really informed my research. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. So what are we talking about when we talk about game and game control and hunting? So just to be clear about what we're talking about, in the early modern period in Breadalbane, there were a number of animals that were regarded as game. The most important were red deer, but within the families of deer, there were roe deer, red deer, and some fallow deer. There was a small population of fallow deer on Inishail in Loch Awe, and there may have been small populations of fallow deer elsewhere in the area. In terms of winged game, fowl, a wide range of birds were protected. So red grouse, black grouse, as you'd expect, ptarmigan, capercaillie. People were prosecuted for hunting herons and ducks and geese. Ground game, so mainly mountain hares, but mountain hares and brown hares were also protected. They don't feature much in the early material, but they are mentioned in legislation. And then finally, when we're talking about fish in this period and protection of fish, we are talking primarily about salmon, but also interestingly in the Glenorchy record, there are several mentions of Arctic char, and surprisingly only one mention of trout in the court record that I looked at. So we'll circle back to some of that later. The flip side of game animals, which were worth protecting and were reserved, generally speaking, to the elite, were vermin. So a wide range of animals were regarded as vermin and could be persecuted and killed indiscriminately by commoners. So that included corvids, so crows, magpies, ravens. For a long time, the Glenorchy Court had a requirement that their tenants must not allow magpies to nest anywhere on their property. Wolves were regarded as vermin and persecuted. Also a wide range of animals in the mustelid family, so otters, weasels, badgers, stoats, polecats, pine martens, otters particularly because of their impact on fish stocks. Foxes, wildcats, birds of prey are really interesting because in the medieval period, when hawking was still very popular and part of the chivalric hunting culture, birds of prey were generally protected because potentially their chicks could be taken and tamed and trained for hawking, for falconry. Towards the end of the early modern period, birds of prey by and large were regarded as pests because of their impact on game bird populations. So their birds of prey transition in this period from being valuable to being vermin. So why was deer hunting so important? We are going to talk about some salmon poaching, but our main focus tonight is going to be deer. So we need to consider, why was deer hunting so important in late medieval Europe and early modern Europe? Partly, my argument is that this is to do with our deep historical connection to deer. So deer have been a quarry for hunters since prehistoric times. So probably since the Paleolithic, definitely since the Mesolithic. And there are some indications that even very early in human history, deer hunting was regarded to some degree as an elite pursuit. Within European culture, deer, especially red deer, are associated with the divines. So Christ revealed himself to St. Eustace through a stag. A cross appeared between the stag's antlers, and thus St. Eustace was converted to Christianity. But that kind of divine association of deer is older than Christianity. So there is the classical Greek myth of Artemis and Actaeon, which is quite gruesome. I need to apologize in advance for this, but Actaeon was a hunter. He spied on Artemis as she was bathing. She took exception to this, turned him into a deer so that his dogs could rip him apart. Quite grim. There's also a fascination with white deer. We've seen one example of that. White deer were the symbol of Richard II of England, and in the Highlands of Scotland, white deer were regarded as to be particularly reserved for a clan chief because the death of a white deer might presage a chief's death. And according to some people, red deer were regarded as the cattle of the Sidhe, the fairy folk. What I would argue, and I'll go on to expand on this slightly, is I would agree with Matt Carmel, who wrote a fantastic book, A View to a Death in the Morning, which is about the culture of hunting and particularly deer hunting in Western culture. And his position is that the importance of hunting lies in its symbolism, not its economics. So hunting, deer hunting, elite deer hunting primarily is not about producing food. It's a symbolic activity. It's an activity about display and conspicuous consumption and ostentation. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail. So, hunting. What did hunting involve? Hunting was primarily, I would say, deer hunting was an elite privilege, and it was regarded as training for war. I'm not going to read the whole of Da Lindsay's verses here, but basically what David Lindsay of the Mount is saying in this verse is that princes can enjoy themselves and distract themselves with hunting into the time of peace and learn to remain heavy spear that he into the time of war may follow at the chase. So clearly, hunting was an activity that young noblemen and royalty should engage in to keep themselves ready for war. And common across a lot of Europe at this time was the attitude that, and this is a translation of a 1599 statute from the Parliament of Scotland, For as much as by common custom of all countries, special prohibition is made to all sorts of persons to slay wild fowl, hare, or venison, except such as by their revenues may bear the charges and burden of the hawks, hounds, and dogs requisite to such pastimes. So basically, if you can't afford to keep hawks, keep a kennel of hounds, then you shouldn't be hunting. Hunting is an elite privilege. There was various legislation in the later part of the 16th century in Scotland attempting to maintain that hunting privilege, largely motivated by the spread of the use of firearms in hunting. So in 1551 and 1563, there were acts of parliament that envisaged a death penalty for people who shot deer with firearms. There were, as far as we are aware, no prosecutions under that legislation. So in 1567, the penalty was reduced to the forfeit of all movable goods, and for a second offence, the loss of your hand. Still very few prosecutions. So in 1579, the penalty was reduced to a £10 fine and a £20 surety. There was then a return to a higher fine in 1594. And this quote is from, the quote that I've just read to you is from a piece of legislation at the end of the 16th century, 1599, that also prohibited the sale of game and set up a closed season for grouse and partridge. So hunting was an activity for the elite, for the aristocracy, and for royalty. And one of the reasons and justifications for that is that this was the class of people who needed to be ready for war. So how did people hunt? So in the late medieval period, deer hunting was there were generally four methods used in deer hunting. There was hunting by strength of dogs, par force des chiens. There was coursing. We're going to look at par force hunting in a minute. There was coursing, where a deer was pursued by 2 or 3 dogs and run down. There was stalking, and there was the deer drive, very important in the Highlands, and we'll come back to them. And in terms of wildfowl hawking, we have mentioned shooting. People did shoot wildfowl with bows. They later shot them with firearms. But wildfowl could also be taken by netting and in traps and with lined sticks. Hares were generally coursed or netted, and later in the period might be shot. And salmon were taken by a wide variety of means, obviously netting, wands or fishing rods, creeves, which tended to be wickerwork traps in rivers, yares, which were stone traps in standing bodies of water, usually in estuaries or lochs, usually estuaries, and also burning the water, which we will return to a bit later on. Just a couple of the hunting methods that are particularly worth taking a look at before we look at poaching in deer forests. So par force hunting, hunting by strength of dogs, was a really highly ritualized pursuit of a stag, so of a male deer. It was regarded as the sport of kings. And when I say highly ritualized, there are hunting manuals that explain that various huntsmen need to go and find the droppings of all the stags in the area and bring them back to the lord of the hunt and argue that their stag is the one that should be pursued. There's a ritual around how a stag is grallochd, how it is butchered after it's been caught. Very, very precise, and all about playing out the social hierarchy of the court in the forest. It was regarded as the pinnacle of hunting in medieval chivalric culture. And to date, the thinking has been that par force hunting wasn't very commonly practiced in Scotland. Duncan Campbell of Glenorchy was engaged in a lot of correspondence with Patrick Murray, who was a courtier in London, trying to persuade King James to establish a deer forest in Glenalmond. And within that correspondence, Glenorchy said, I believe he, King James VI, has not ane forest that he may chase ane deer down ane water 16 miles of length upon a horse's back. So he was arguing that Glenalmond would be an excellent place to start to establish a deer forest because there was this stretch of river that you could chase a deer down with your dogs on horseback. But very little evidence that it was actually practiced in Scotland. The deer drive, on the other hand, was very important in Scottish culture and especially in the culture of the Gaeltacht. So the deer drive was a large communal effort. It can be regarded very clearly as practice for war or for conflict, and also as a demonstration of community cohesion. So how did the deer drive work? So the deer drive worked by the tinkle, the beaters, driving deer towards hunters who either waited at a constriction, so they might wait at a crag or a river or an elric, a human construction that provided a barrier that would stop the deer and allow them to be slaughtered, or the hunters would be lying prone in ambush. The beaters would drive the deer, red deer and roe deer, and any other animals that were caught up in the beat towards the hunters. And basically, there would then be a free-for-all with hand-to-hand weapons, bows, guns, dogs, spears, clubs, whatever came to hand. An attendance at the hunting, usually as a beater, was a common obligation on tenants. John Taylor, who wrote The Penniless Pilgrimage about his trip to Scotland in 1618, was invited to participate in the Earl of Mar's hunt. He describes a process whereby 1,400 to 1,500 men formed the tinkle, the beaters. So 1,500 people are beating the deer towards the hunters. 200 Irish greyhounds are involved from the dogs. And this results in a hunt that produces about 80 deer to be eaten. Deer drives were very, very important in the Highlands. But they were also practiced, similar game drives were practiced in other parts of the world. So there's accounts of really spectacular game drives in the Zulu Empire in Southern Africa. The Iroquois in North America would drive white-tailed deer towards something that's the equivalent of an elric. There were deer drives in Central Europe. Lucas Cranach the Elder has done 2 amazing oil paintings of deer drives in the Habsburg Empire, and in the Incan Empire, vicuna were driven the way deer were driven in Europe. And on a smaller scale, bow and stable hunts in England were similar to a deer drive. So that is the deer drive. Very important to the culture of the Highlands in the late medieval and the early modern period. If you imagine that the deer drive required an entire community to be mobilized and organized, it was a really conspicuous display of how many people a lord could mobilize to follow him, how organized they were, how cohesive they were as a unit. And therefore, I would argue there was a degree of signaling to neighbors and rivals about your own power. So the other hunting method that we need to cover briefly is stalking. So many modern day deer stalkers believe that deer stalking started in the mid 18th century with Macpherson of Cluny going deer stalking. Stalkers of deer are actually mentioned in legislation in the Scottish Parliament in 1425. There is legislation outlawing the stalking of deer. Basically, stalking can be understood as simple stealth hunting with a missile weapon. To start with, that missile weapon would have probably been a longbow in the late medieval period. And over time in the 16th century, the longbow was replaced in some cases by a hagbart, a firearm, a musket. It's worth noting that even with stalking, dogs were needed because very often the attempt to kill a deer would not succeed. It would injure the deer, and then the dogs would be needed to finish the job. This illustration on this slide is a stalking horse. So throughout various parts of Europe, various different outlandish contraptions were developed to assist in stalking game. So this is basically a dummy horse. So the idea is that the stalker would use this dummy horse to disguise his shape so that deer or other game that he was stalking would look at this and think, oh, there's a horse, that's not a human with a gun. And there were also stalking cows and various other iterations of the same kind of idea. So three important hunting methods were par force hunting, the deer drive, and stalking. Into the 1700s, what we see is a decline of the deer drive. And by the end of the 1700s, by the end of the 18th century, the favoured hunting activity for country gentlemen was either driven or walked up game bird shooting. So out with dogs, like in this illustration, with your gun, hunting feathered game. And this was part of the rise of the gentleman sportsman trope, and maintaining pheasant coverts and stocks of partridge on lowland estates and grouse on highland estates became a really important part of aristocratic culture and estate management. Why hunting methods changed and how is difficult to say. Certainly, the development and spread of firearms had something to do with changing hunting methods. There is some tentative evidence that climate change may have impacted some game populations and may have changed the target of hunting. In the English context, some historians have argued that the social disruption of the civil wars in the middle of the 17th century meant that deer were freely poached by soldiers, and therefore there weren't enough deer to be hunted, and then that's why the aristocracy in England moved towards fox hunting. Certainly there's changing social contexts, and the decline of the deer drive is related to changes in the social context of the Highlands and the deer drive being less important. So onto the Breadalbane estates. My research has looked at the control of poaching, management of deer reserves, how commissions of forestry work, and just a reminder that within the Breadalbane estates, there are two major salmon rivers, the Tay system and the Orchy and Awe system. So what was happening with tenant poaching? So from the Baillie Court, so a Baillie Court functioned like a Baron Court, and it meant that anyone who was the tenant of Lord Glenorchy or otherwise his feudal inferior could be brought to that court to answer for a crime. There are bylaws regarding poaching. We're not going to read the whole of this one out, but basically within the Glenorchy lands, it was anyone who shot game or killed salmon faced a £20 fine for each offence. And similarly, because the court could only prosecute Glenorchy's tenants, they had to make a provision to prevent other people from poaching on Glenorchy land. So they said that any person who gave meat, drink, or house room, or any other kind of bield assistance to anybody on Glenorchy's land who was shooting game without permission would be prosecuted. So if your tenants assisted an outsider who had come to hunt, they could be prosecuted and fined. Within my research, I looked at 4 early court books, starting in 1573 and ending in 1657. And in this period, every firm town, every small settlement was required to report at least once a year on the state of its woods and game. Within this record, I identified 747 reports or accusations relating to game, of which there were 192 convictions, with fines ranging from 10 shillings to 40 pounds. And there were also 11 acts of caution. The kind of offences tenants were accused of and prosecuted of were slaying game. So by far the commonest offence was simply you killed game. Occasionally, the accusation was more specific, that you were shooting, but there were also prosecutions for reset, eating, sale, or purchase of game, assisting others who had hunted. Carrying a gun was an offence in and of itself. Having a dog could be regarded as an offence. Use, in terms of salmon, use of wands, nets, or creels or creeves, and also burning the water. In terms of the kind of species that people were prosecuted for, bear in mind that in some cases people faced an accusation over multiple species. So that's why there's a lot more than 747 cases here, because a lot of the accusations about deer also included an accusation about roe or an accusation about salmon. But the range of species ranged from Arctic, the usual things that you would expect, all the way through to wild geese, herons, and one case of a capercaillie being shot. What's interesting to note is that with the big 3, red deer, roe deer, and salmon, there were a lot of accusations and a lot of requirements to report, but a relatively low level of prosecution. Whereas with the less common game types like ptarmigan and capercaillie, there's a conviction rate of 100% because there was only one case involving a capercaillie. And that suggests to me that accusations and requirements to report about deer and salmon were routine, whereas if the court was to look at a case of someone, for example, poaching ptarmigan, it would be about a very specific incident that had been witnessed. Interestingly, the Arctic char cases fall into there are only 2 periods where Arctic char are of interest to the court. There's a period in the 1590s and another period in the 1630s where tenants are accused of killing Arctic char on Loch Tay. And in both cases, the periods also correspond to periods of dearth. So it may well be that tenants were pursuing a fish that they normally wouldn't pursue through hunger, or that the estate was keen to protect species because they knew there was a food shortage. Who did the poaching? So tenants were often accused in the course of a routine report about their bala, their farm town. Generally, people poached in their own locality. Nearly all the people accused of poaching were men. Out of the 747 cases, 9 women were accused. There is evidence that guns were widely used for poaching deer. There are a few cases that would suggest that of persistent poaching that would suggest people who were semi-professional. And there was certainly at least one case of game birds being taken to Perth for sale. Mostly, it was principal tenants who were prosecuted. There were some cotters and some servants in evidence, but mainly it was principal tenants. So these are likely to be middling sorts. So not the poorest people in the community, but people with a little bit of resource. And certainly in the case of deer poaching, with access to a firearm. Reset, which means handling illicit goods, was most likely to involve salmon or wildfowl because they're easy to handle and easy to conceal. And there are even some cases of people assisting outsiders, which was to be expected, or even the laird's own family. So Patrick Reich was convicted and fined £5 in 1617 for shooting wildfowl and resorting within the laird's bounds with the Laird of Weems fowlers. So Mingus of Weems had sent his fowlers into Glenorchy's lands to get some game birds, and Patrick was assisting them, and he got nabbed. And in 1620, Duncan McKean cleared himself of venison. So he was accused of poaching deer, except for the reset of 2 roe and 2 red deer that Donald the Laird's son had brought into him. So Laird's son is out doing a bit of illicit hunting, and he brings the dead deer to poor Duncan, who gets convicted of it. He was only fined 1 merk. Well, there's a limited amount of information in the archives about why people poached. We can make some tentative conclusions about periods of famine or dearth, especially, as I said, the Arctic char cases from Loch Tay. There are cases of assisting outsiders. There might have been some cash exchanged for that assistance. Like I said, some sale of game birds. There does appear to have been a lot of local exchange, especially of salmon, gifting salmon within the community. I wonder whether some tenants actually poached for the sense of sport or a sense of entitlement. And no doubt some game that was killed by poachers was an important additional source of protein for people. Moving on to deer forests. So we've looked at tenant poaching. Moving on to deer forests, we very quickly. So deer forests had a special legal status. It was land that had a special legal status. It meant that grazing, tree felling, and access to game within a forest was strictly controlled. It meant that stray livestock would be confiscated, and many forests were managed to have an area or a nursery which was particularly well protected to help deer reproduce and have a safe haven to go to. The prevention of poaching was really important in deer forests, but interestingly, the thing that started to cause friction, especially towards the end of our period, is that deer forests tended to be on upland that also provided good summer grazing. So, who looked after forests? So, generally speaking, the king or a feudal superior, a big lord like the Earl of Argyll, would give someone a commission as forester. They'd be empowered to enforce forest law. They'd be empowered to apprehend poachers. They could control the access of livestock. They would sometimes be required to supply a certain number of deer to their lord every year, and they were charged with protecting timber. What's really important to understand about a position of being keeper of a forest is that it was not the same as having tenure of the land, and we're going to look at that in a minute. In the Breadalbane area, there were 6 main deer forests. Coirica Ba, which corresponds roughly to the present-day Blackmount deer forest, Blackmount Estate. Bendoran was managed as a forest, and MacLellan was a royal forest. The Campbells of Glenorchy at various points also had commissions from the Earls of Argyll to look after the forest of Benmore, a forest at Ben Cruachan, and the tiny forest on the island of Inishail in Loch Awe. So just to finish, I wanted to tell you a little bit about two forests, MacLellan and Cúiriceabá. I've used the spelling from the archives for Cúiriceabá to distinguish it from. So what you can see here is actually the corrie that is called Cúiriceabá on modern day Ordnance Survey maps, and it's part of a much bigger deer forest. So this is just an overview of the area. This is the castle at Achalader, River Orchy, Loch Tulla, Loch Ba is up here. This is Rannoch Moor. Cúiriceabá, or the Black Mount, covers nearly all of this area of mountains here. It was a massive forest. MacLellan Forest was much smaller, and we have very, very specific information about the boundaries of MacLellan Forest because of the MacLellan dispute. And we can look at that on the next slide. So, in the case of MacLellan, until the late 16th century, MacGregor keepers looked after MacLellan for the king. At some point in the late 16th century, the job of keeping the forest for the crown transferred to the Campbells of Glenorchy, and in 1587 they recorded a perambulation of the boundaries of the forest in order to assert to Campbell of Glenlyon, Glenorchy's cousin, where the boundaries of the forest were, because you can see here that the forest, this is the forest here, this is Glenlyon, this is Glenlochy was Glenorchy land, Glenlyon was obviously in the control of the Campbells of Glenlyon, and the forest straddled the mountains in both glens. So Duncan Campbell of Glenorchy became keeper of the forest. There's the first surviving commission of forestry was from 1596. And then there were various repeats of that commission until it became hereditary in 1619. Throughout the early part of the 17th century, two things happened. Duncan Campbell used the Commission of Forestry to lever land around the forest from other people into his own possession. So remember I said that forests did not convey tenure of land. There was an area roughly here, which was the Merkland of MacLellan that was in the hands of Duncan and Robert Abrach, who were MacGregors. They gave up the Merkland, but were kept on as keepers of the forest for a while. And then eventually Duncan complained to the king that they were outlaws, which I believe was a move to deny them any kind of right to compensation for the land that he tried to take from them. Bigger dispute that he had was with Campbell of Glenlyon. So throughout the 1610s and 1620s, Campbell of Glenlyon asserted that he had the right to establish shieldings on this north side of MacLellan and to hunt in MacLellan. He was so persistent in this, despite Glenorchy getting a commission from the Privy Council to destroy shieldings in 1625, that throughout the 1610s and 1620s, Glenlyon and his servants would periodically hunt in the forest. And from the existing documentation notes to Glenorchy about that hunting, I've calculated that Glenlyon and his servants killed about 77 deer, and roe deer and red deer, in that period. Towards the end of the dispute, Duncan Campbell of Glenorchy invited Campbell of Glenlyon to go hunting with him in the forest, and Glenlyon was so enraged that he had to ask his wife to respond to the invitation. She berated Glenorchy, saying that you're so determined to defeat us in this that my husband mindest to resist you insofar as God will give him grace. So this was really, really deep animosity. But things seem to have improved between the two families after Duncan died in 1631. And really importantly, Robert Campbell of Glenlyon who inherited the estate later in the 17th century, began to lose quite a lot of his land holdings because of his own financial mismanagement and gambling issues. This was the same Robert Campbell of Glenlyon who was involved in Glencoe massacre. So by the end of the 17th century, most of Glenlyon was not in Campbell hands anymore. And then eventually in the early 18th century, via the Duke of Atholl, two landholders took up most of the land in Glenlyon. So James Mingus of Kildares and MacDonald of Kentnock. And when they took control of the land in Glenlyon, they very actively encouraged their tenants to use the grazing rights that they asserted in MacLellan. They asserted that the north side of the forest, initially they argued that the north side of the forest belonged to them, and this brought to a head the whole area, the whole issue of the designation of a forest not being the same as land tenure. And although the boundaries of the forest were clear from 1587, there was a long and protracted dispute. It went to the Court of Session 3 times, and it went to the House of Lords 3 times. And in between those legal cases, there were also physical confrontations. So in 1733, the Earl of Breadalbane's forester complained to John Campbell of Highland, the Earl's Chamberlain, that a group of people had encroached on the royal forest and had killed 10 or 12 of, interestingly, the Earl of Breadalbane's deer. They were actually the king's deer. They had done this with dogs, guns, and clubs, the snow being so deep that some of them they catched alive and knocked in the head. This barbarous kind of hunting can appear with no other countenance than malice. So there was legal action accompanied by physical assertion of rights. In the end, in 1744, the House of Lords made a decision that the boundaries of the forest were accurate, that they were, as I've shown on a previous map, but because of custom and use, Kildares and MacDonald had a right of servitude to the shealing grounds in the north side of the forest. Very quickly on Cúricha, this is just a more detailed map of Cúricha, as well as the White Hind incident. There were raids in 1612 and 1613 by Cameron of Lochiel and Ranald of Gargavich. In each of the raids, strangely enough, the notes to Glenorchy say that 17 deer were taken, including in McRanald's raid a white hind. I think we can take with a pinch of salt whether exactly 17 deer were taken in each of the raids, but what is interesting is that these raids occur in a period when Cameron of Lochiel is involved in a dispute with Huntly and the Earl of Argyll, and MacRanald of Gargavich is later implicated in the MacDonald revolt on Islay. So whether these deer raids are part of a wider scheme of political activity and conflict is quite hard to determine. Interestingly enough, 100 years later, the Earl was actively considering renting the forest out to drovers, which is something that he had taken issue with Kildares over during their dispute. Finally, just to close, I'd say we've long acknowledged the role of cattle raiding in intercommunal disputes and rights of passage for Highland clans. We've long recognised the role of bonds of manrent, wadset, and various forms of tenure in the way lords developed their territory. My proposition is that the control of game, whether it was through prosecuting tenant poachers or neighbouring lairds or through the management of forests, direct or on commission, was another equally important element of early modern lordship in the Highlands. Thank you very much.
Superb. Thank you very much, Ian. I thought that was fantastic. I learned so much in that talk. I'm sure we've got lots of questions. So what I'll do is I'll allow everyone to switch on their cameras and their microphones so they can put their questions directly to you. Or if you would prefer, you can pop your questions in the chat and I can read them out. So I'll just quickly hit those buttons. There we go. And we've got someone on the button already. Mike, come on in.
Hi, thanks very much, Ian. That was absolutely fascinating. I was just wondering, is there any data on the sort of density, the number of deer in any of these places? Obviously, that's quite a pertinent issue at the moment. So, is there any indication of counts or numbers at all through any of the records?
No, there are later counts of deer from the 19th century from the Blackmount in the Breadalbane archives. There weren't any counts of deer that I was able to find. What there were, though, were instructions to foresters that defined how many deer they were obliged to supply to the laird each year. Quite low numbers, actually. So I think the highest number I came across was 12 deer a year from Currachaba, from the Blackmount, effectively. But usually somewhere between 6, 8, 12 deer from each forest per year. So that gives an indication of what they thought was a sustainable amount to take out of the forest for the table.
Right. Okay, thanks very much.
Super, thanks very much, Mike. Ross, come on in.
Hi, Ian. Fantastic presentation. Loved it. My question's based on because you kind of briefly covered it earlier in the presentation regarding you were talking in terms of these convictions in the Baillie Court of dearth of food supplies and also of climate. I wondered did you consult any kind of like paleoclimate proxy records on like a speleothem proxy record, and how did that correlate to prosecutions and rate of conviction? Because you mentioned that there was a small period in the 1590s and the 1630s of I think it was the
Arctic char.
Arctic char, yes.
Yeah.
I wonder if you found that more that kind of interconnectedness between climate and especially because we're coming into some of the more, especially in the later 17th century, the kind of the worst of the Little Ice Age. I'm just wondering how much did that influence your research and kind of your interpretations?
So I did consult published work on climate history, but I didn't go direct to source material. Unfortunately, the court record for the later 17th century, which would be really interesting, is not as good as it is for the earlier 17th century. So it was hard. That would have been a harder bit of work to do. I think all I could, as far as I could get with it, was a tentative correlation between the estate being very interested in asking questions of its tenants about whether or not they are poaching and periods of dearth or famine. So we know there was periods of dearth and famine in the 1590s. We know in the 1620s and the 1630s things got difficult. I didn't look at the 1690s when there was an extended period of extreme weather events and dearth and famine. So the short answer is kind of yes and no, and I think there's more to be done there.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Professor Richard Orham's work?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
He's that's kind of how he's the go-to. But no, thank you so much. Definitely answered my question. Thank you.
I've just noticed some questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'll read them out just for the recording, but thank you very much, Ross. So we've got a couple of questions about the Elrics, so I wonder if we can maybe bunch them together. So Mary's asking if there's any evidence of any of the walls or Elrics.
So there's no evidence that I'm aware of Elrics in Breadalbane. There is one surviving on the island of Rum.
Okay.
A stone Elric. And it's basically, imagine a big V-shaped dry-stone dike. And the idea being that the deer would be driven towards the point of the V, inside the V, if you like.
Yeah.
So yeah, the best preserved one is on Rum.
Brilliant.
There's also in Glenlyon, there is a place named Elrig at the bottom of Finglen, which is part of MacLellan Forest, and I haven't been able to establish whether there was ever any kind of structure there that would resemble an Elric, or it might just be that they used that place name indicates this is where we kill the deer.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. I mean, it gives you an idea of the scale, right?
Yeah.
That's involved in some of these drives. Lynn's got a question about beavers. Were beavers present, and if they were they recognised as vermin?
No, beavers were extinct by then, as far as we're aware. I'm sure they would have been regarded as vermin had they been around, but no, unfortunately not. And then
there's a lot of question about traps being used for deer.
Absolutely no evidence of traps for deer. I think Scandiver, when he was trying to find the white hind, would probably have been planning to use nets to capture it. There are references in other court records. So the Regality Court of Melrose, there's a case in the late 17th century of two fowlers, so people who kill birds for a living, using engines to capture moorfowl. So engines just being any kind of trap. Okay. It's kind of, it'd be really intriguing to see what they were.
Yeah. I'm just following up on the discussion at Elric's. Collins noted that the Elric on Rum seems to be near the end of a cliff.
I'm not sure what's going on there. Whether
Yeah.
the idea is that the deer are caught between a rock and a hard place, quite literally. You know that, and that you might be driving some of them off the precipice. Hard to know.
Yeah. Okay, so keep your questions coming in, folks. I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege and ask a question of my own, and it's about, unsurprisingly, from a military historian. I wanted to ask you about guns, and around obviously the shifting practices of hunting that you mentioned there. And I was just thinking about things like the Statutes of Iona, 1609, and there's a provision in that about the use of guns, particularly for hunting. But a lot of historians have viewed that as quite a cynical political move, and it's about actually disarming the clans. What do you make of that in terms of your research, and can you sense the shifting attitude towards firearms across the late 16th and 17th centuries?
Yes. So there's a range of statutes that are passed in the Scottish Parliament, some of which are about shooting at game with firearms, and some of which are about carrying firearms and causing trouble with them. And I think at least one of which is about both. You know, it's that so the preamble of the legislation talks about, I'm going to paraphrase now, but not only are people being murdered, but also the game is being slaughtered by people carrying guns in an uncontrolled way. I think we have to remember that in this period, a lot of parliamentary legislation was very expedient. So it was about, we've identified a problem just now, we're going to make a declaration about it in the hope that we will then enforce that for a period. What I think is really interesting is one of the bits of legislation in the late 16th century actually introduced a fine for judges, so people who had heritable jurisdictions, who failed to prosecute poachers of deer. Because I think what was happening is Parliament was making grand declarations about the punishments we're going to impose on people who shoot deer with firearms.
Mm-hmm.
But then in local contexts, lairds were not following that through and actually prosecuting people.
Yeah.
So I think there was a tension, because obviously there's also a defence of the realm question about we need a supply of firearms, we need people who know how to use them.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And certainly I would imagine that after any period of conflict, at least some firearms would go astray and end up in people's barns for later use in poaching. So I think it was contradictory, I would say. I think, and I do wonder whether a lot of the prosecution, especially of tenant poaching, was quite performative. So I think there's probably a lot more of it going on, and it was only people who were viewed as taking a particular liberty who were actually prosecuted, and often the monetary penalties were not as severe as you might expect.
Yeah, okay. Just because I was just thinking while you were speaking there about the cultural significance of archery as well, and especially in the Highlands, and about whether there's an attempt at the local level to preserve that, as well as obviously the restricting the firearms. Colin's put a question in about he's just got a clarification on the rum elric, saying that it leads to a raised beach below, and it looks like the deer could have been driven over it, and then potentially retrieved by boat from the sea.
Yeah, entirely possible. I think that's really interesting. Deer traps in the landscape around Rum.
Yeah, that's just for the recording. That's just Cass question there about there's some archaeological evidence for deer traps around Rum, sorry, and in the borders, and some Bronze Age deer drives as well. So these are obviously, practices with a real heritage, and something I was pretty ignorant of actually before tonight. Brilliant. Are there any other thoughts, questions, folks? Nope. I thought your point at the end there, Ian, about the deer raids is really interesting, and about is this actually just another theatre in which these lords and lairds can get one up on each other by nicking each other's deer? I mean, it's pretty convincing, right? Because these are a commodity, and especially when you were talking about the Glen Lyon dispute, there's clearly a status attached to controlling these forests and controlling the herds.
Yeah, and I think that there's what we didn't touch on because there wasn't time, is that the deer, all game has a kind of unusual legal status. So all wild animals can't be owned. So there's a tendency in legislation to prosecute the act of hunting rather than having in your possession a dead animal.
Okay.
The right to hunt deer was inter regalia, so it was a royal right that could be conferred in feudal tenure. So there's, and I do think my own view is that deer raids weren't so much about getting your hands on the venison as demonstrating that you could do it.
Yeah.
It was, like you say, getting one up on on your rival.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, is there any sense of how common these deer raids were? I mean, you obviously mentioned the deer raids in 1612, 1613, and I think the fact that everything starts to kick off in Islay around that time is probably not a coincidence, given the people involved. But
Yes.
but yeah, is there any sense of how common these were? Is that the only incident that you found in the Breadalbane estates?
In the Breadalbane estates, that was that, and Glen Lyon's kind of
Yeah,
persistent
okay.
poaching in MacLellan. There are incidents elsewhere, and in the English context, oh, his name escapes me now. There's a brilliant book called called Hunters and Poachers about Tudor and Stuart England, and that raiding deer parks, raiding a rival's deer park was a kind of proxy for
Yeah,
war.
absolutely. Yeah, okay.
And I think probably in the Scottish context that I kind of think of raiding someone else's deer forest as kind of similar to a cattle raid. You know,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it kind of operates in the same way, right?
yeah.
We've got a final question there in the chat from Lynn about the difference in status between deer hunting then and deer hunting now. I don't know if you maybe want to finish up on that, Ian.
I'm not a deer ecologist, so my understanding is there are a lot more deer now than there were then. First of all, by some estimates, kind of, I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 6 times the kind of sustainable level of population.
Yeah.
There's a lot of deer in the Highlands. Uh, Deer fences do exist, so deer are fenced in to some extent, but that's more about keeping them out of areas rather than fencing them into areas, if you see what I mean. So my understanding is that deer are generally free to roam, and they were in the Scottish context in the early modern period. Deer were free to roam in and out of forests, and that there is evidence of deer herds encouraging deer to move in particular directions to try and keep them in a particular area because it was easier to protect them.
Yeah. Okay, okay. Fantastic. Right, I think we've put you through the ringer enough, Ian, and we'll let you off for the evening. But just can I ask everyone to join me in the customary awkward online round of applause? But thank you very much, Ian. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Just before I let everyone go, I will very quickly just show you what's coming up at the Institute for Northern Studies. So our next seminar is courtesy of our very own Lynn Campbell, who will be speaking on the 28th of April, and that will be a hybrid event. So if you're in Orkney, you can come along and join us at UHI Orkney campus, or you can plug in at home as well. And that will be on Did Nobody Die? Rousey and Eglesey Kirk Session 1733 and 1747. If you like money going missing and questionable morality, make sure that you tune in for that one. But a massive thank you again, Ian. That was fantastic. Thank you to everyone for tuning in for this evening. Remember, it will be available on our YouTube channel in the next week. And I hope to see you at the next one. Thanks very much, folks.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again, Ian, and thanks again, Andrew.
Thanks, Ross. See you later on. Right, that'll